Hi everyone, today I wanted to share with you another video featuring my gorgeous Graphic 45 papers. It was a project that I made as part of my design team Audition, and I wanted to share some of the techniques that I used with my Bohemian Bazaar papers to create a really sunny and pretty card. And it started out with one of these little cards. Now these cards are really versatile. They come in all of the Graphic 45 design papers or collection, should I say, and you can use them for so many things. They're great for journaling, they're great for using and making into tags, and today I'm going to share how I'm going to use this particular one here as the inspiration for my card today. So I'm going to be starting out by creating a woven panel for our card, and that's going to measure 5¼ inches by 7½ inches, but we will trim this down later on. But to start with, we've got 3 pieces of paper, yellow, green and blue, and they measure 5¼ by 7½ inches. And now I'm going to divide this strip into 1/4 inch sections. This is where the Tim Holtz ruler comes into its own, or any kind of gridded ruler, because it allows you to keep everything absolutely straight and parallel. And I'm going to divide the back of this piece of paper into 1/4 inch strips. So I'm starting out by creating a 1/4 inch margin across the top of the piece of card. Now this will be the place that I will cut up to when I'm creating my little strips to weave the other paper strips through. I'm drawing lines across the piece of cardstock every 1/4 inch, and that's where the grid on this ruler comes in very handy. It keeps you nice and straight, and at the end I thought perhaps I'd made a mistake because it looked like I wasn't straight at all the nearer I got to the end, but it's just I haven't quite cut the panel straight, and I just checked that using the grid on my craft mat. As you'll see, I'm just turning it around, squaring it up, and I can see that I've just not quite cut this straight. So I'm going to carry on marking every 1/4 inch, and then I'm just removing that little section at the end. So hopefully you'll cut it right first time. I also started to use my knife at the beginning, but I was having trouble with the ruler slipping on the paper, so I thought it's much safer just to use my scissors. And it's that little 1/4 inch strip that I made across the top of the card that we're cutting up to, and that will hold the little paper strips that we're going to weave through together while we're working on the woven panel. So I've created a nice fringe with my blue piece of cardstock, and next I want to cut 1/4 inch strips from the yellow and the green cardstock. Now I'm not going to need all of this piece of card, so I'm just cutting a few strips, and then I'll cut a few more if I need them as I go. So I'm just cutting some 1/4 inch strips. I've got some in the yellow and some in the green. Next I want to anchor the blue panel to my craft mat, so I'm adding a strip of double-sided tape across that 1/4 inch margin that we left at the top of the panel, and then I'm going to use that double-sided tape just to hold it nice and still on my craft mat while I get weaving with the other strips. Now the trick to getting a nice finish with this is taking your time and making sure you push all of those strands of paper right up to so they're right next to each other on every single row. It does take a little while because the paper strips do want to stay right next to each other. That's the base layer. So what I'm doing in order to push it right up to the top is just lifting those strips away from the strips that are on the underneath part of the row, and that allows me to push this up into position. And the other thing that you're going to need to do is to glue the ends of the strip to make sure that this doesn't slide while you're working on the next strip. I'm just adding a little dot of glue at each end, and that will hold that strip in place while we come in and go in the opposite direction. So I'm now going over, under, and again I'm taking a little bit of time just to make sure that's nice and snug right up against that yellow strip, and you'll feel that it does sort of stick to the row underneath, but it just means you just have to lift that top layer a little bit, and it will just give you enough room to push that green strip into place. This is quite a nice process, but it's something you just want to take your time doing. Don't think that it's going to be really, really quick. It's just quite methodical and quite relaxing to do. Now I could have more colours than just the two that I've chosen, but I'm sticking with a colour scheme, and I'm pretty sure that you could get some interesting effects, and you could, if you were really dedicated, to create a sort of two-layer colour scheme on the base piece if you wanted to. I just thought it'd be nice and easy to have the base piece in a single colour, and then to alternate the colours of the strips that I'm weaving through. And because these patterns on this Bohemian Bazaar are really sort of quite delicate and quite small, it means that I get lots of interesting texture from the strips as they weave in and out of one another. I'm just coming up to the final two strips. A little bit fiddly at the bottom because you've only got very small strips of the blue cardstock left. And then last but not least, a final strip of green, and this time I'm going to glue all the way along those ends. So I'm just adding a little dot of glue as I weave the paper over and under the final little tiny sections of blue paper. Now you may find if you're a little bit over generous with your glue that you stick your panel to the craft mat, so just be a little bit careful when you're removing the finished piece from your craft mat, that you do so carefully so that you don't rip anything once you've got this far with the design. Just that final little dot of glue, and then just removing the piece. You can see how bright the patterns are on the other side. It's actually quite attractive, but it's not the look I'm going for this time round. So I'm just flicking it over onto the other side and securing those last little pieces on that bottom row. So now I want to finish off the pattern, so I'm just trimming off any excess pieces of strip that go across the weave. I haven't got too many, just some little tiny bits. And then what I want to do is finish off. You can see I've still got that one blue strip across the top, so I just want to weave another green strip across there so the panel looks complete. So I'm just taking my craft knife and drawing or continuing that line across to the top of the piece of paper. Now this one's going to be a little bit more tricky because it's already got the double-sided tape on it, but I'm going to take a green strip, and obviously I don't need to add the glue now, and I'm just going to add that green strip to the top of the panel. Actually, it looks like the bottom of the panel, but it was the top of the panel. So I hope I've shown you how easy this is. Obviously you could alternate the width of your strips if you wanted to create a different look. You don't have to have your sort of down strips every 1/4 of an inch. You could perhaps have one, you could have them random. You could have an inch, then a 1/4 of an inch, then 1/2 an inch. You could mix it up and you'll get lots of different effects depending on the width of your strips and the amount of patterns you choose to mix in with one another. And if I'd have done these squares in just 2 colours, and if I had perhaps made them slightly bigger, you would have got a really obvious checkerboard effect. So just finishing off the other side of the strip that didn't have the double-sided tape with a little dot of glue. I'm going to be mounting this onto a white cardstock base, but first of all I want to trim my greeting down a little bit because it's covering up all of that lovely woven work that we've just done. So I'm just trimming the outside frame from this panel. So I'm just taking my scissors and following that blue line, and that way we'll reveal a little bit more of the woven panel that's going to be beneath this card. So these cards that come in the collections are really, really useful. They are a great starting point for a card, or they're great for journaling, or you could actually mount or mat your photographs in the centre sections and use the outsides as frames. So they really are quite useful, and I think this is going to be a great centrepiece for this card. My white card base measures 11.5 inches by 8 inches, and I've scored it at 5 3/4 inches, and I'm going to be using it in the landscape position. Now I'm cutting a piece of green cardstock to measure 5 1/4 by 7.5 inches, and I've decided to use that as a mat around the edge of the woven piece. So I'm going to trim the woven piece down slightly. Now you might want to use double-sided tape. I like to use glue when I'm putting my cards together because I'm not sure when this one will be given, and I have found that sometimes double-sided tape, particularly with that extra weight of the woven panel, doesn't always stay stuck. So I like to use my Cosmic Shimmer glue. And now I'm going to take my lovely panel. I need to be a little bit careful here that I don't make things come apart, and I'm going to trim it down slightly so that it fits in the frame that I've just created. So I'm going to trim this down to 7 1/4 inches by 5 inches. And then because I'm going to stick this straight on to that panel, I'm going to make sure I put glue on any of those little sections that I've released by taking off the bottom strips. So sometimes when you're working on a card that you have a plan A in mind, and then you come up with a plan B, and that's exactly what's happened here. I thought I liked the edge of the panel as it was, but I'm a bit of a one, I like to see things framed. I'm the same with my scrapbook pages. It just seems to finish everything off by having a little frame around, and it helps draw your eye into the focal point of the card. So I do like to leave these things in so that you can see that if you did want to alter your panel in any way, all is not lost. You can cut it slightly smaller. Just be a little bit careful to glue those little ends that you will release if you trim the woven panel down. But it's got enough body in it. The fact that you've woven it nice and tightly means that it won't just spring apart. So you have got leeway to cut it into smaller panels if you want to. And we also want to cut another piece of white cardstock so that we can lift that greeting panel from the centre of the card a little bit more. I know it's got the dark line, but I think it would just balance a little bit better with a white card frame. So I'm going to measure the little panel that I've got. So perhaps if you've used a different panel to make your card, and I'm just going to increase the dimensions by 1/4 inch just to get a nice narrow white frame around my greeting panel. So it happens that mine comes out at 3 3/8 inch by 5 1/4 inches. So I'm just going to glue everything into place. So I'm starting by gluing the woven panel into position. And I'm making sure I've got plenty of glue around that outside edge because this is quite hefty now that we've woven all those papers together, and I want to make sure it stays nice and flat against the card. And then I'm centering that on the green panel that we attached earlier. I'm just going to pop that under this craft mat while I work on the next section. That'll help everything to glue nice and flat. And then again, I'm just going to glue the greeting onto the white frame. So because the elements that we're using to decorate this card are very, very dimensional, I'm going to raise this portion of the card. I'm not too worried about postage because I can't flatten it any further once I put those daisies on there. So if you want to make this card and you're a bit worried about postage, it's probably a good one to deliver by hand if you can. It's always nice to have the inside of your card match the outside. So I've cut another panel of the blue that measures 5¼ inches by 7½ inches. And I'm just going to sit that in the middle of the inside of the card base. So we're going to make 3 daisies in total. I've already made one small one and I'm going to show you how I did that. So I've got a piece of cotton sheeting that measures 1 inch by 4 inches. I'm folding it in half and I'm just running along the bottom of the 2 layers. So the running stitch is holding both the layers together. Make sure that you put a knot in the end of your thread, and also it's wise to use a double thread because you are going to pull this. I've just managed to create a knot here in my thread. You are going to pull this into a gather, so one thread you might run the risk of actually breaking it as you pull it nice and tight to form the daisies. So use a double layer of cotton or a double layer of thread and then do a nice neat running stitch along the bottom of the 2 pieces of fabric. And you can see how that's all going to gather up when we pull that into our flower shape. So I'd say I'm roughly going just maybe slightly more than every 1/8 of an inch in and out of that bottom piece of fabric. So you can see that that will pull into a flower shape, and you could actually not do this step to turn it into a daisy and just have a little rosette, but now I'm cutting halfway into the fabric, again roughly every 1/8 of an inch, to form the petals of my daisy. And you want to do that before you pull the fabric round into a rosette. So roughly halfway into the fabric and every 1/8 of an inch. And then you're going to pull your thread. I'm just giving it an extra stitch because I've got not got quite to the end, and you're going to pull it round to form a rosette. So I'm just holding the 2 edges together. Now the best way to describe this is it kind of concertinas, a bit like when you're making the rosettes that you fan fold with paper. So you want to make sure that those 2 ends marry up so that they lie nice and flush against one another, so that you cannot see the beginning of your ruffle and the end. So just spend a little bit of time getting that nice and neat and then catching the 2 ends of your fabric together to form that little daisy. And then I'm just taking the thread back through just to tie everything off, and there we have our second little daisy. Now we're going to repeat that process with a slightly bigger strip to get a bigger daisy. So this time the fabric strip measures 1½ inches by 6 inches, and you're going to repeat the process by folding the strip in half and doing a running thread along that bottom edge to join the 2 sides of the strip together. So you can see how easy it is to upsize or downsize your daisies, and I'm just going along at the bottom creating the running stitch ready to pull this daisy into shape. So to form the petals, again I'm cutting about halfway into the strip and about every 1/8 of an inch. and then forming the rosette and just adding a couple of stitches to hold that daisy in position. So that's 3 daisies complete, and now we need to decide what we're going to put in the middle of the daisies to finish them off. So I found some lovely sunny yellow buttons to match the yellow paper that I've used in my paper weaving, and match the centres of the flowers on the greeting. And then I'm just using that embroidery thread to create a little kiss in the centre of each of my buttons. Now, it doesn't really matter if you manage to pull the button through the centre of the daisy. You'll find that I do that on this video because we're kind of sewing into the hole at the centre of the daisy. Really, we just want a nice little kiss shape without creating too much bulk by having to put the threads in and out. I'm just going in and out of the button twice on each of the strokes that form the kiss shape in the centre of the button. If it isn't caught into your daisy by that point, just tie off the thread at the back of the button, and then we're going to use hot glue to hold this on the card, and we'll just hot glue the button into position. I managed on this one to catch it straight onto the daisy, so I'm just tying it off at the back as we would if we were sewing on a normal button, but you'll see it gets a little bit more tricky on the smaller daisies. So as I finish off the little stitching in the centres of each of those buttons that don't stay attached to the 2 little daisies, I just thought I'd say that perhaps you haven't got Bohemian Bazaar papers, but you've got other paper collections like Secret Garden or Little Darlings, or well, any of them really. You could use this card design with all of those collections. So you could select one of those journaling cards that had an appropriate message that you wanted in the centre of your card. You could make fabric daisies in colours to match the papers that you pick, and just change the background card to match the papers that you've picked. Some of the Graphic 45 papers have a slightly more creamy background, and you could start with a cream card base, or perhaps you would want to go for more of a contrast and have a black card as your base and work from there. So really, the beauty of Graphic 45 papers is they are easy to mix and match and come up with a whole new look and use the same card design. So hopefully you'll have more luck sewing the buttons to the centre of your daisies than I did. But as I said, it really won't make any difference because I'm going to hot glue them into place anyway. Now, the other thing that I've gone ahead and done as we put this card together, I'm going to slightly offset this raised panel. So I'm raising it up to the top right hand corner slightly on the card, and that gives me more room at the bottom left hand corner to add those details with the daisies. And I've cut out a couple of ferns using a tattered lace die, and I've cut them in the 2 contrasting papers in the blue and the green, and they really match those flowers in the central panel nicely. I did think I might add buttons to those, but I haven't got them small enough. Perhaps you have. That would be quite a nice finishing touch on the card. So once you come up with a pleasing arrangement, it's ready to switch your hot glue gun on and stick everything into position. So because I've got 3 little daisies, I'm going to add 3 little pairs of leaves, and you can see that I'm just shortening them slightly. They're just slightly too long for the position that I want them to sit in, and I'm just going to move them out slightly and add that little daisy on top. So I'm nestling those daisies together and tucking the little fern leaves underneath, and there goes my button. No one would ever know that I haven't stitched it to that daisy. So adding the final pair of leaves and the final little daisy. If you wanted to, rather than use hot glue, you could use silicone glue to put everything in place, but you're going to have to leave it to sit a little while the glue sets up, and make sure that those daisies don't fall off the card. Then adding that final little button into place. Next, I'm going to finish off the inside of the card. So I've got a panel that measures 3¼ inches by 7¼ inches, and then I'm just going to arrange a couple of leaves on top and add my greeting, and that is my card finished. So this time round I want to make sure those ferns are nice and flat on the inside, so I'm adding glue to each of those leaves and then making sure it's firmly stuck into position. So I'm working on the top left of the card and the bottom right, and again I'm using one green fern leaf and one blue. So before I add the greeting, I just wanted to embellish my card a little bit further. So I'm using a dimensional paint. You could use something like Perfect Pearls or Cosmic Shimmer do a pearl PVA. This happens to be something that I've had for absolutely donkey's years. It's still going strong. It's by Plaid, and it just happens to be in the perfect colours for these papers. So I'm just kind of further embellishing the card and just adding a little bit of tactile texture. Once these are dry, they'll just form tiny little pearl-like drops on the card. And I just think because it's got all that lovely pattern, it can take that just that little bit extra embellishment. And I'm also adding a little dot around the ridge of my buttons. So now the top of the card is all dry, I can work on the inside of the card. I'm adding more dots exactly like I did on the outside of the card. And then last but not least, I'm just going to add a little happy birthday greeting. Again, this was a tattered lace die, and I think cutting it in that gorgeous blue paper finishes the card off a treat. So as usual, all that's left for me to say is there'll be a link at the end of this video so that you can pop over to my blog and pick up the full cutting guide for this card. I really hope that you give this lovely paper weaving technique a go with your Graphic 45 papers. Any of the little prints that come in the paper collections will work for this. Just mix and match the colours. You can even mix and match your collections and you'll come up with a lovely woven background that you can use on your projects, whether it be a card like this one or a scrapbook page. And that was my dog just barking there in the background. Better go and check if he's barking at the postman. And before I go, once again, a great big thank you to everyone that's been leaving messages of encouragement and support as I wait out, oh, this week seems to be going forever, for the announcement to whether or not I make it onto the Graphic 45 team. Keep those fingers crossed, and don't forget, if you like this video, hit the subscribe button, the share button, the like button, and spread that creativity. And I look forward to sharing more projects with you again very soon. Thank you for watching. So here's some links to take you in lots of directions, all featuring lovely Graphic 45 inspiration. So this one is over to my blog where you'll find the full cutting guide for this card, and I really hope that you want to try and make something similar to this for yourself. then there is a link to my round 2 video. So I created a romantic page using my birdsong papers. Then a completely different look, and that's the thing that I love most about Graphic 45, always somewhere new to explore. Again, this is with Bohemian Bazaar papers, so another video for you to see how I created this. And then a blast from the past. This is my Graphic 45 playlist, and you will find the tutorial for this page over on that playlist.